Hello and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin and I'm here with the Beast of Kings Park himself, Michael Whitehouse. Mike, how the heck are you?
Do you know how bad that sounds? The actual Beast of Kings Park. That has a different connotation. We're just going with the cryptid connotation with that one. I'm fine. It's been a festive season. I believe this episode is going out in the new year.
Yeah, January at some point.
So, do we say Happy New Year to everyone?
Happy New Year. I think we've said that already in a previous episode, but we'll say it again. Happy New Year to everyone.
Oh, well, that just shows that we've recorded all of these well in advance.
It shows that we're prepared, Michael.
I've got a little bit of the festive season. Well, I say I've got quite a lot of the festive season still going on. Can I just describe to you my current situation?
Please do.
I am currently wearing a Christmas cardigan that has reindeer on them. I have a skull-shaped tankard filled with Advocaat lemonade.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surrounded by boxes from Christmas.
Of course.
And I am also sitting in my computer chair, which I believe is now broken. And I'm just reclining in it now. It won't let me sit up properly. So
you're ruined by Christmas.
Yeah, that's my situation right now.
Okay, so you're listening to, I think, the 8th episode of Talking Till Dawn?
Yes.
And this is the third part of our series dealing with the Loch Ness Monster and the Loch Monsters of Scotland. In the previous 2 episodes on this topic, we covered the history of these beliefs, going back to the water horses of mythology, the legend of St. Columba and the aquatic beast. We've talked about some of the encounters with water monsters that have occurred in Scotland over the years, looked at some of the evidence, some of the expeditions and studies that have been carried out. In this somewhat delayed final episode on the subject, final for the time being at least, we will be focusing on the question of what is the Loch Ness Monster? Is there even anything there? And if there is, what might it be? Now, of course, as in any situation with a controversial mystery such as this, there's probably going to be a lot of opinion mixed in here, and some of that may differ from some of yours, and that's fine. With this kind of thing, I think there's a lot of room for speculation.
We love a good bit of speculation though, Martin. We love a good bit of speculation.
Yeah. I've tried to stick to the facts here as much as I can, where facts are available. In a lot of this, there are no facts available. Speculation is the name of the game. With that out of the way, Mike, I suppose the best place for us to start is with the most popular explanation, what everyone thinks of when you say the words Loch Ness Monster, the idea that a breeding population of relict plesiosaurs somehow survives in Loch Ness and perhaps also in
Martin,
Morar, Marie, and other bodies of water in the Scottish Highlands. Mike, I can hear your enthusiasm for this idea. Comparisons between reported sightings and these prehistoric creatures go right back to the early 30s, and it remained a leading hypothesis for researchers until at least, I would say, the 1970s, when the efforts of the Academy of Applied Sciences and the LNPIB, that's the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau, the Bureau,
sounds official,
further popularised the idea. Since then, the plesiosaur Nessie has become a well-worn pop culture touchstone, from exploitation movies to kids' cartoons to South Park. But is it at all credible as a real-life explanation? After all, a humped, long-necked reptile would nicely fit many of the photographs we have, and lots of the detailed eyewitness reports have elements that are at least reminiscent of these creatures as they appear in popular culture. Now, do you know much about plesiosaurs, Mike?
Not a great deal.
Okay. Then I shall tell you all about plesiosaurs, because I have learned all about plesiosaurs
Beautiful.
For this episode, just for you. The plesiosaurs first emerged in the Triassic period, approximately 200 million years ago, with the last known specimens disappearing from the fossil record at the time of the same extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. They were not a single species, but an order of marine reptiles which included within it a huge number of individual species with a variety of different types adapted to different niches and time periods, much as there have been many different species of whales and dolphins since those animals first emerged. I think there's an idea that a plesiosaur is one thing and there was only one species of it. We're talking about something that was an order rather than a species of animal. Speculation about how such a creature might have found itself in a freshwater loch usually goes a little something like this. You have a small population of plesiosaurs that somehow survives the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, and their descendants live on for thousands of millennia, species separating and evolving as they adapt to new conditions and to fill new ecological niches. Then, somewhere around 10,000 years ago, towards the end of the last Great Ice Age, a group of one of these descendant species migrates into a narrow arm of the sea that opens up as the glaciers retreat and the sea levels rise. Soon afterwards, as the enormous weight of the ice sheet continues to disappear from the land, the continental crust of northern Europe bobs upwards in a process known as post-glacial rebound. Once again, this stretch of water becomes separated from the ocean, and the animals in the loch at that time become separated from the sea in what will become a freshwater loch miles inland eventually. The wider population somehow goes extinct, leaving only this loch-bound group as a relict population. So that's how plesiosaurs might have come to be in the loch if plesiosaurs were in the loch, if that makes sense, Mike.
Case closed. Goodbye, everyone.
Far from it, unfortunately. The first big question this raises: where is the evidence for plesiosaurs living in Earth's oceans during the intervening 65,990,000 years? How, you might ask, have we this wealth of fossil evidence for a multitude of different plesiosaur species existing between the Triassic and the Cretaceous periods, but since then nothing? Well, while that is problematic, it's not quite the deal breaker that it might seem. There are rare but well-documented cases of creatures supposedly extinct, sometimes known only from the fossil records, later being discovered alive and well. Gracilidris, or Gracilidris, not sure how you pronounce that, but it's a genus of South American ant, known only from a single 20 million year old specimen found trapped in amber in 1985, was discovered in 2006 to not only still be alive, but to be endemic across Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. I don't know how they missed that, but apparently it was everywhere.
Oh, that's amazing.
But it was first discovered trapped in amber from millions of years ago. More famously, and I'm sure you've probably heard of this, Mike, the coelacanth.
Coelacanth?
Yeah, you knew it. Which is an order of lobe-finned fish, which was thought to have been wiped out in the same extinction event as the plesiosaurs, was rediscovered in 1938 by museum creator Marjorie Courtney Latimer, as she found it not in the depths of the ocean, but for sale in a South African fish market. There's even a scientific name for this. Paleontologists refer to these reappearing life forms as Lazarus taxons.
That's fantastic.
It should be noted that few, if any, of the known Lazarus taxons have been animals as physically large and as geographically widespread as plesiosaurs. But however hard that pushes up against Occam's razor, the precedent at least leaves a little room for argument. Another big question though is, how could a marine species, something that originated in salt water, be living happily in a freshwater loch? This is once again a difficulty, but not a fatal one. While most plesiosaur species seem to have been oceanic specialists, there is evidence that other variants adapted to the brackish and fresh waters of rivers and estuaries. A descendant species that even finds itself attracted to sea inlets in the first place would probably be one adapted to survive and hunt in rivers. One thing though, that all plesiosaurs and all reptiles have in common is that by definition, they breathe air. Now, Mike, you're not going to like this, but I think this is where the plesiosaurs get into some real trouble as an explanation for loch monsters.
I'm not going to like this, Martin. It's plesiosaurs, and that's that. Okay.
While Loch Ness is indeed the largest body of water in the British Isles by volume, its surface area is only 56 square kilometres. Long and thin in shape, if you were to take a lochside walk along the whole length of the loch, Mike, at no point would you be more than 3 kilometres from the opposite shore. In all but the worst conditions, the opposite bank would be visible the entire time. The setting is not the lonely wilderness sometimes depicted in popular culture. In movies and cartoons, when you see Loch Ness, they sometimes make it look like it's miles from civilization.
Yeah.
In fact, the banks of Loch Ness are peppered with villages, holiday homes, hotels, car parks, observation points. It's bustling with day trippers and coachloads of tourists.
Loch monsters. Littered with them.
All over the place. But the major trunk road of the A82 runs the entire length of the northern bank on its way to Inverness, a city of 70,000 people, just barely out of sight at the northeastern end of the loch. Loch Ness itself even forms a stretch of the Caledonian Canal. Not as busy as it used to be, but it's still a working waterway used by fishing trawlers, hotel barges, luxury yachts, craft passing from the Atlantic in the west to the North Sea in the east, with the loch being joined to the man-made portions of the canal by a series of lochs at its south-west and northeast tips. In short, this is not the Himalayas. Loch Ness is a very finite, inhabited and relatively busy place. Even if no one was actively searching for a monster, there would still be, at any one time, a lot of pairs of eyes on the water, covering a good portion of the loch. The requirement of something having to surface in order to breathe is disastrous when you take that setting into account. A breeding population of large aquatic reptiles coming up regularly for air would be routinely observed, not like a smattering of sightings and blurry photographs a few times a year, but constantly, like multiple times a day. Given that people are actively searching for a creature, where is the mountain of clear visual and physical evidence we'd expect to have obtained by now? Where are the cascading bubbles emerging at the surface from such a large creature exhaling underwater? A single air-breathing animal, anything much bigger than a big seal, I would say, would struggle to stay hidden in an environment like this for any length of time, let alone a colony of giant reptilian monsters permanently trapped in the loch.
That's kind of the big problem, isn't it? Is the whole idea of breeding population.
Yeah.
That's the issue more than anything else.
Even a single plesiosaur, and of course, a single plesiosaur couldn't reproduce itself, so it would very soon become extinct, but even a single plesiosaur would very quickly be seen. These things crawled out onto land, they have to come up to surface to breathe. The loch is full of boats. It would be seen every single day, even one of them. That problem is then multiplied if you take into account the other lakes in Scotland and further afield in which similar creatures are claimed to live.
What would you say is the most remote loch then that would be large enough to maybe have something in it?
Oh, I mean, I'd have to look at a map, but Loch Morar, Loch Treig, places like that are a lot more remote than Loch Ness. But again, anything that has to come up to the surface to breathe, over time, you're going to get great photos of it. You're going to have dead bodies. You're going to have lots of physical evidence of something big like that has to surface. If it's something that can hide at the bottom, that can stay way down in the depths, then it's conceivable that it can remain hidden. If something that comes to the surface once in a blue moon, maybe when it's sick, or, you hear about these creatures like strange sharks and other abyssal animals that live in the sea that we barely know anything about, and we only encounter them in very rare circumstances when they come to the surface. That's a lot more believable than something that is obliged to surface every few minutes or hours to breathe.
Yeah.
The idea of deep underwater caves has sometimes been proposed as a way of...
So I was going to ask you about this.
Yeah.
This is the one that used to fascinate me as a kid.
Exactly, and me as well.
The idea of like something that either hides in the caves, or even something that if there's some cave that reaches from Loch Ness to the sea and something migrates.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Mike. I'm so glad you mentioned it. So this underwater cave idea has been around for a long time. It gives Nessie a convenient place to nip out to while the sonar teams are scanning the loch. They always say, well, maybe she slipped into a cave and we can't find her. It could give her a place to come up for air away from, the prying eyes of tourists.
Yeah.
Even a channel, as you say, to the North Sea. The Ted Danson movie Loch Ness, do you remember that?
Yeah.
The Ted Danson movie uses this trope to explain how its plesiosaurs remain undetected. Spoilers there for a mediocre 25-year-old movie, by the way.
I never thought Sam Malone would end up investigating the Loch Ness Monster, but carry on.
As a young lad in the 90s, reading anything and everything monster related that I could get my hands on, by the sounds of it, you as well, Mike, the existence of, quote, tunnels to the sea was something often talked about without any corroboration. It was taken for granted, just part of the accepted lore of the subject. Unfortunately, Mike, I'm sorry, not only is there a lack of evidence for such tunnels, there's a very good reason to believe that they do not and could not exist at Loch Ness. No subaquatic cave has ever been detected here, and the solid geology of the Great Glen is mostly composed of hard, dense, metamorphic rocks. The Carboniferous limestone in which large air-filled systems tend to form is not present, and if you watch the Ted Danson movie, when he goes down into the cave, there's all these stalactites as if he's in like some sort of Carboniferous limestone cavern. That's not what the geology of Loch Ness is like at all.
I trusted you, Ted Danson. I trusted you.
In any case, since the surface of Loch Ness sits higher than sea level, any tunnel joining it to the sea would have a tremendously violent flow of water rushing from the loch to the sea. So if a plesiosaur went out, slalomed down this tunnel, it would be almost certainly a one-way trip. The currents and the vortices produced by that would be quite noticeable on Loch Ness. You'd have a big plug hole, effectively, like a big vortex on the surface. And there would be a detectable upwelling of fresh water off the coast, none of which has been observed. And what's more, an open plug hole such as that would have a tendency to very quickly block itself by pulling in logs and other debris. So that's kind of out, unfortunately.
So what you're saying is Loch Ness is not a giant bath?
No, unfortunately it's not. If it was a giant bath, Mike, it might have plesiosaurs in it. And that is a sentence I never thought I would say. Besides the canal, which is dammed by locks, there is one other way a large marine reptile could travel to the coast, and it's the route used by the vast majority of marine visitors to the loch, but it's the River Ness, and as the path of least resistance, by far the simplest and least convoluted route, the route a giant predator would take if it was coming in and out of the loch. Unfortunately for Nessie, it travels right through the heart of Inverness, which is only a few feet deep as it passes under the busy roads and Victorian footbridges of the town. A migrating giant reptile from the Cretaceous period, it's going to turn some heads in the middle of Inverness, I think.
Maybe it's wearing a Scotty hat and...
He'll fit right in. As if that wasn't enough, modern paleontologists have more or less confirmed that the long-necked plesiosaurs could not raise their necks vertically up into the air. It seems they had a line of bony ridges along the back of their vertebra that would have prevented their neck from bending in that direction.
Right.
They were evolved for swooping their head downwards to catch fish, not for craning their heads upright in the classic Loch Monster pose. The classic Loch Monster pose being the main reason anyone suggested plesiosaurs in the first place.
Okay, so what we tend to see as the classic image of a dinosaur-like Nessie...
Mm-hmm.
Right, are you saying then that even dinosaurs that did resemble what people think of as Nessie...
Well, plesiosaurs weren't dinosaurs, but
right, okay, yeah.
What I'm saying is that even plesiosaurs wouldn't have looked like that.
Right.
They looked like that in films. You remember like old movies, they used to have the T-Rex standing dead upright like he was a man and walking around. And then they realised that a T-Rex wouldn't have been able to stand like that. It would actually lean forward and its tail stuck up. The tail balanced it rather than dragging on the ground. They kind of worked out what position these animals would actually have taken in life, and that was different from how they were presented in both popular culture and in early scientific drawings. The same applies to plesiosaurs. They wouldn't have held themselves in that manner. The manner in which Nessie supposedly holds herself with her head straight up out the water and a hump behind is informed by popular culture. It's very, very unlikely that even a descendant of a plesiosaur would have just so happened to take exactly the same form as our mistaken belief of what form they would have taken. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Disappointing again, Martin, but I get it.
It is disappointing, but it's not case closed. For all these reasons and more, the plesiosaur is one of the least likely of all the Nessie culprits. Okay, but that's not the only potential suspect. A variation on this prehistoric survivor theory proposed by Dr. Roy Mackal of the International Society of Cryptozoology replaces the giant reptile with an extinct giant mammal, a zeuglodon, which is a kind of primitive serpentine whale. However, again, the key criticisms that apply to the plesiosaur also apply to the zeuglodon. I think if Nessie is an air breather, she must either be a relatively small and unremarkable one, in which case you wouldn't call it a giant animal, or if she truly is a giant, she must be something that doesn't need to come up for air at all. If, on the other hand, you're one of those people who believe that the Loch Monsters of Scotland truly are some sort of metaphysical or supernatural entity, then, of course, that's something completely unaffected by any of the logistical, biological arguments that can be levelled against the plesiosaur theory. A spirit doesn't need to breathe, it presumably doesn't show up on sonar, it can appear and disappear at will, and this is something that some people genuinely believe. The earliest version of this, and something some people believe to this day, is of course the Echusk, the magical water horses, the legends of which we discussed in the first episode, Mike. Jonathan Downes of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, which incidentally publishes a journal called Animals and Men, which I have a few issues of, and I always have to hide them when we have visitors around because surely one of the seediest names for a non-pornographic magazine ever.
Animals and Men, Volume 16.
Jonathan Downes coined the term zooform phenomena to refer to a class of supposed entities that outwardly seem corporeal but have supernatural qualities. So things like the Jersey Devil or the Bodmin or Dartmoor beasts. If you wanted, you could classify the Loch Ness Monster under the same umbrella. Others will come right out and suggest that the Loch Ness Monster and other lake monsters are quite simply the ghosts of dead plesiosaurs. If such a thing were possible and likely, it would certainly explain why similar things are seen at separate, far-flung locations around the globe, but never captured, never conclusively proven. Loch Ness, Loch Morar, Lake Champlain, Flathead Lake, they're all big, wet, haunted houses full of prehistoric ghosts.
It's kind of like the demonic ghost distinction. So in one case, it's something that is supernatural, that exists in a kind of spiritual way, an immaterial way.
Yeah, sort of elemental or just something that we don't understand, something that maybe is natural but not something that our scientific knowledge encompasses, something that exists on, I don't know, I mean, I don't really buy into these ideas, but, you know, people might say they exist on a different plane or that kind of thing.
Interdimensional Bigfoot.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the other hand, you will have people that say that they could be ghosts of dead animals, i.e. dead plesiosaurs. And, you know, that could apply to also the Yeti, the Mukili Umbembe, the Chupacabra. You could say that they're all like prehistoric spirits. Okay, it doesn't explain why it's always the cool animals that leave ghosts.
Yeah.
It's always a dinosaur or a plesiosaur. You never hear of like a ghostly crab.
Yeah. Why aren't hunters out in the wilderness constantly saying, "Don't waste your ammo, Fred. That's a spectral deer over there." And there's a possessed tree. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, obviously we're being a bit facetious here, but to me, it's a little bit of a futile exercise to argue for or against these kinds of metaphysical explanations. When you try and explain an apparently biological phenomenon in terms of the supernatural, it always feels like you're kind of giving yourself a bit of a carte blanche. You're going, I can match any sighting, I can explain away every inconsistency. Two people describe the same thing in two completely different ways. Oh, okay, a spirit can appear however it wants. Oh, we scoured the whole place from top to bottom and didn't find anything. Well, the magic fairy just made itself invisible.
The magic fairy does do that.
It does. That's the problem with magic fairies. I think you can't get anywhere when the whole theory is based on something that inherently moves the goalposts every time you try to establish some facts. I mean, it doesn't feel like you can prove it or disprove it, and I'm cool with anyone who chooses to believe in the paranormal necessity hypothesis. I think it's an interesting idea, or the zooform phenomena idea. It's a very cool idea. More power to you. I just don't really accept that theory personally. I would rather try and find something physical.
Yeah.
At the complete opposite end of the spectrum to this, you have a range of possible phenomena that point to entirely natural, so not supernatural, but natural, but non-animal explanations, whereas zooform phenomena is like animal and supernatural. This is like non-animal and natural.
Non-Animals and Men, Volume 72.
It's a really complicated way of saying, like, even a log pulled along by a current just under the surface, or a mirage on the distant surface creating an illusion of an undulating form in the water, or a seiche, which is like a resonant standing wave that can easily look like a series of slow-moving humps in the water, and are commonly seen in enclosed bodies of water. The lochs of Scotland, more than most, it would seem. There's something about the long, narrow bodies of water and the typically high hills around them channeling the prevailing winds and the low-level geological activity from the Highland Boundary Fault that seems to really lend itself to this phenomena. And of course, these kinds of explanations are a favourite of lazy would-be debunkers, knee-jerk debunking.
Yeah.
And it should be borne in mind that there are some supposed encounters that just don't fit any of these no matter how you look at them. But we can be absolutely certain that at least some reports are misidentifications of natural phenomena. The reason I mentioned these 3 examples, other than just being the 3 most commonly cited ones, is that I have personally experienced all 3 of them.
Oh, sorry, I turned into Kevin Williams. Kenneth, I don't even know who Kevin Williams is. Kenneth Williams for a second. Sorry, there's a reference from 1962.
Carry on up the loch.
I had watched that.
In the spring of 2019, Gemma and I were kayaking on Loch Morlich near Aviemore when we saw this black, glistening, scaly-looking thing rear up out of the water, lifted its head above the surface, shat myself.
No wonder.
We paddled over to it, and the closer we got, the more it looked like the head of like a giant fish or a mutant crocodile or something.
Oh man.
It was trailing awake, and it was diving under the water and poking its head up diagonally as if it was gasping for air. It was the weirdest thing, man. As we got close though, the closer we got, the more features it seemed we could make out. Fins, gills, maybe a mouth.
Oh my god.
Until we get close enough you could reach out and literally poke it with the end of your oar, and at that point, only then, was it obvious that what we were looking at was a broken log, covered in weeds, and it was drifting and bobbing through the water at a weird angle. Probably had branches attached to it under the surface that was like catching a current or something.
Yeah.
We were able to paddle right up to it, and it didn't even look like a log until we were almost on top of it.
That's what's interesting. You think about people looking at things from the shoreline.
Exactly. If we'd have been standing on the bank, if we'd have been unable to reach it to dispel the appearance of a head, we might have just taken that first impression away with us. And I think takeaway impressions like that only tend to get more ingrained over time. You become only more sure of what you saw over time. I've seen a seiche as well a few years ago, summer of 2015 I think it was. We were doing a road trip around Scotland and we stopped on the A82 at Loch Ness. And from the parking spot by the road, we could actually see it was a wave. It was a long undulating wave, but it seemed to be standing still, or like it was travelling slowly against the ebb and flow of the water, but at roughly the same speed as the rest of the water was moving, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. If it had been dark, or the light had been hitting it in just such a way as to throw the side of it into shadow, it would really have looked like it could have looked like a moving hump-backed object.
Yeah.
Then this autumn, you remember Callum and I went on that camping trip to Inchconnecan on Loch Lomond?
Yeah.
If anyone also follows our YouTube channel, Ghastly Tales, they might have seen the video that we shot. There is a lake island with an abandoned settlement on it and a population of feral wallabies on Loch Lomond. It's a really strange place. Do check the video out if you haven't. If you search for exploring an abandoned Scottish island, I think it should come up. But while we were rowing out there, and this didn't make the final cut of the video because it was so far away and it didn't show up on the wide lens of the camera we were using, but we saw a big mirage spread out to the north of us. And it looked like, again, a series of humps moving around on the water. It was similar to if you've seen a road shimmering and reflecting the sky on a hot day.
Yeah.
The water in these lochs isn't that warm, but it does hold a lot of latent heat. As my geography teacher would drill into our heads at every opportunity, land heats and cools much quicker than water, so the water is often slightly warmer than the surrounding land and air, and this causes this effect when seen from a low angle quite often. In our case, it looked like it was catching the wake of a distant boat, and the little fluctuations in the height of the water were being magnified upwards into sort of bends and wobbles. And it wasn't static, they move around, so I could easily see why that might be construed as an animal. In fact, if I hadn't been doing research for this at the time, hadn't just read about this effect,
Yeah.
I might even have been taken in by it myself. Loch Lomond, incidentally, does have a monster tradition.
Really?
Yeah, but it's said to be more like a giant crocodile than a serpent, so no, I'm pretty sure it wasn't a real monster. And of course, wakes on their own, caused by boats and even small birds, don't always behave exactly how we might expect. A small bird swimming can make a surprisingly clear wake on a still loch, or cormorants, goosanders and the like can dive under the water and swim around chasing fish, and this can create a disturbance from beneath. Otters inhabit the loch as well. This is a rarely spotted mammal that can grow to 5 feet long, can create wakes and so forth. They can poke a head out of the water most unexpectedly. They can also run around on land, and that might account for some of the land sightings. People are often very surprised by how big these things can be. Going back to mirages for a moment, it's not only waves and wakes that can combine with this effect to cause strange sightings. Even among the most experienced, most expert witnesses, the sort of people the most zealous believers would scoff at the very fact we would even dare to question their version of events. And there's one very good example of this. In 1933, the water bailiff, Alex Campbell, saw, well, let's have it in his own words, shall we? One day early last month, that was September the 7th, 1933, at about 9:30 in the morning, I was watching this end of the loch. The light was very uncertain and there being a fairly thick haze on the water, and along with this, the sun was shining directly in my eye through the mist, making the visibility very hard. I had not been watching for more than a minute before I noticed a strange object on the surface about 600 yards from where I stood. It seemed to be about 30 feet long, and what I took to be the head was fully 5 feet above the surface of the loch. The creature, if such it was, and at that time I felt certain of it, seemed to be watching two drifters passing out of the canal and into Loch Ness, and whether it was due to imagination or not, I could have sworn that it kept turning its head and also its body very quickly, in much the same way as a cormorant does on rising to the surface. I saw this for fully a minute, then the object vanished as if it had sunk out of sight. So, a very classic Loch Ness monster sighting there, 30 feet long, neck rising out of the water, humps trailing behind, but he goes on. Last Friday I was watching the loch at the same place and about the same time of day. The weather was almost identical, practically calm, and the sun was shining through a hazy kind of mist. In a short time, something very like what I have described came into my line of vision again, and at roughly the same distance from where I stood. But the light was improving all the time, and in a matter of seconds I discovered that what I took to be the monster was nothing more than a few cormorants. What had seemed to be the head was a cormorant standing in the water and flapping its wings as they often do. The other cormorants, which were strung out in a line behind the leading bird, looked in the poor light and at first glance just like the body or humps of the monster, as it has been described by various witnesses. But the most important thing was that owing to the uncertain light, the bodies were magnified out of all proportion to their proper size. This mirage-like effect I have often seen on Loch Ness, although not exactly in the same form as I have described. Other people who know the loch can verify my statements as to the mirage, but it only occurs under certain conditions and if the loch is calm. Then it gives every object from, say, a gull or a bottle to an empty barrel a very grotesque appearance, provided that such objects are far enough away from the observer. So this guy was the water bailiff of Loch Ness, very, very familiar with the loch. You've got an expert witness who was positive he'd seen a monster until by sheer chance the same objects and the same conditions presented themselves again, and he was able to do that very rare thing in monster hunting, a repeated observation.
Shows you though, doesn't it, that if someone who is familiar with the water and how it behaves normally, and that they get sort of pulled into this way of thinking.
Exactly.
That someone who's just passing, who isn't familiar with the water at all, I mean, they're just going to see monsters everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And all credit to this guy for not covering it up or doubling down. He retracted it based on new evidence. And even he did seem to have flip-flopped a few times in later years about what he saw, but I think it just goes to show eyewitness testimony is shaky. The human mind is malleable and easily tricked, and it happens far more than we would like to admit. It's not a rare 1 in a million thing. Not one of us is immune.
That is interesting though. The fact that he's kind of reported it first, then went back on it. Because you think, has he reported it and then been mocked?
Maybe.
But to be fair, it sounds like a very precise explanation.
Yeah, definitely. I would tend to trust the more recent explanation rather than one he has made years down the line when he's had time to go over it in his mind and add new details. I think expectations go a long, long way to framing an observation a certain way, and even the way questioning is carried out can shape the memory of what is being recalled. There's a wealth of experimental evidence to support this. Every psychologist in the world, and you being one, Mike, will tell you this.
Well, I'm not quite a psychologist, but I studied it for quite a while.
People make mistakes in some of their observations, especially when dealing with ambiguous sightings. Even experts can make these mistakes, and often people only double down or get surer of their mistakes as time goes on. But I can't stress this enough. I don't think these explanations account for every supposed monster that's been seen or claimed to have been seen in Scotland's lochs. Those two guys on Loch Morar definitely didn't have their boat almost capsized by a mirage.
Yeah.
So by talking about these natural phenomena, by saying that these surely must represent some percentage of sightings, we're absolutely not saying that that closes the case. Not necessarily. But as we've discussed in the last Loch Monsters episode, it's established fact that some portion of sightings and some proportion of the supposed evidence is accounted for by hoaxes and tall tales. We can't quantify how big that proportion is, but it's an inescapable fact that hoaxes and misrepresentations have been carried out. And knowing human nature, it seems likely that the number of hoaxes might be more than just the ones that have been publicly dismantled as well.
Yeah.
We can also assume that a certain proportion of those are an honest misidentification of various natural phenomena, as we've just discussed, as well as human and animal activity. The question, I think, is between the prevalence of hoaxes, either by or on the people reporting them, between that and the prevalence of misidentifications of various things, what would that leave us with if we could take them away? If we could press a button and just remove them from the equation, would that leave...
aliens?
Aliens. But would it leave enough unexplained sightings that we'd even be talking about Loch Monsters in the first place? I don't know. I mean, we're not omniscient. We don't have a time machine. We can't exactly get numbers on these. We can't go back and check. So it's just a thought experiment, but the point of me saying this is it's kind of how I frame the question of Loch Monsters in my own head. If you could separate the chaff, would there be any wheat worth mentioning? Strong believers tend to frame the body of evidence as a big body of convincing evidence with like a few hoaxes and errors on the very fringes. I kind of see it the opposite way. I'm looking for any sliver of the genuine unknown that might be hidden among all of this misdirection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would like to think it's in there somewhere. The jury is out. Having looked into it, knowing the hoaxes, knowing some of the poor science that's been done on the subject, having seen the quality of the evidence, understanding a little bit about the fallibility of the human senses and eyewitness testimony, knowing the unusual but entirely mundane phenomena that often occur in the water of Scottish lochs, I don't feel great about it. I'm not saying there's nothing to it, but I have to admit that I do have some doubts. However, let's continue to approach this with an open mind, Mike.
Always.
We always do. Let's accept for now the argument that there is something large and strange living in Loch Ness, and maybe some other lakes and lochs, so that we can take a look at what kind of animal that might be. Something less impossible than a plesiosaur, but not just part of the everyday, well-known fauna of a lake of its kind. In his 1968 book, The Great Orm of Loch Ness, author F.W. Holliday presented the idea that these creatures were invertebrates, possibly a kind of giant worm or slug. This was an idea also put forth by Roy Mackal around that time. Among other things, this accounted for the variations in shape that have been reported. There are a wide variety of invertebrate morphologies, to say the least, and many of them can extend or contract their bodies or grow massively or shrink or swell up. So when you've got people claiming to see one hump, some people claiming to see two, that's not a problem if you're not dealing with a rigid body. It could even be shaped somewhat along the lines of a plesiosaur due to convergent evolution, or be capable of taking a shape similar to that. Holliday actually liked a descendant of something called Tullymonstrum gregarium as a candidate.
Tremendous name.
It's a strange fossil known more popularly as the Tully monster. It's a really bizarre looking thing from the late Carboniferous. I suggest you look it up, and I do love this idea. I think it's probably my favourite Nessie candidate, just on entertainment factor. Not in the sense that I'd necessarily believe in it more than the others, but I find it fascinating. It's fun, it's weird.
So what was it? Was it like a big mollusk then? Or?
No one's quite sure how to categorise it. Some think it might be a worm, some think it might be, like a slug type creature. It's got weird protrusions, and you should definitely check it out. In fact, we'll do a series of notes like we did for the first and second episode, and we'll include some images of it, and we'll put that in the podcast notes. You should be able to open it up and have a look.
I'm Googling this immediately. Oh yeah, no way. Yeah, it almost looks, it's almost got a kind of, at the back of it, it looks like some squid.
Yeah, well this is the thing, no one knows whether it falls under, is it related to squid, is it related to worms, is it related to mollusks?
But I'm looking here in the Wikipedia article, and there's that's fascinating, because the shape of it.
Yeah, you see?
Yeah, you could absolutely think that's like a plesiosaur.
It's like a giant, maybe leech-looking thing. It's a proper sci-fi monster.
Yeah.
And it's very improbable, just to be clear. I'm not saying this is what the Loch Ness Monster is, but it's not quite as comically absurd as a plesiosaur. You'll notice it has gills. It doesn't need to surface all the time to live. And in fact, it is a strangely elegant solution in its own way. It doesn't need to breathe. It has a soft body with no lungs, so it probably wouldn't have a great sonar profile. It might even be able to reproduce asexually, so a small population spread across various lochs with little contact isn't so much of a huge problem.
No dead bodies.
Exactly. It could be something that hides in the mud or burrows underground. It might not even have a skeleton, as you say, so it's not leaving proof of its existence in the fossil record. When one dies in the present day, a lump of slime bobbing to the surface or on the lakeshore isn't going to draw the attention that a plesiosaur skeleton would.
Yeah.
F.W. Holliday was a journalist and angler who had previously written books about fishing, so of course he had an interest in aquatic issues. In the 1960s, he was a member of the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau, and he believed that loch monsters were the same thing as dragons and worms of English folklore. Several of the creatures in Welsh and Irish folklore as well. He proposed that at one time these worms would have inhabited rivers and lakes across the British Isles, but their numbers had dwindled. They'd become endangered, I suppose you'd say, and now they're only found in a few bodies of water.
That is really interesting, because like WURM.
Yeah.
Dragons used to be called that.
Or WYRM as well.
Is it YRM?
Yeah, but it's a solid, interesting idea, I think. You can't hear those sirens, can you?
Yeah, I did hear them a bit in the background.
I suppose it doesn't matter too much.
It's alright, just adds ambience.
But Holliday's theories on this continued to develop after he published The Great Orm of Loch Ness, and eventually he drifted away from physical explanations and he flew off into the fringe realm of high strangeness in the direction of Doc Shields and those kinds of thinkers, although I think Holliday was a lot more serious about it. His follow-up book, The Dragon and the Disc, starts to add a supernatural element to his invertebrate loch monsters, and he started tying them into UFOs and mystical prophecies, as I think you deduced there from the word disc. That rabbit hole would take a whole other episode to explore. Maybe we will go down that one day. But during his time with the LNPIB, the Bureau, he noted that Nessie sightings seemed to coincide with chance events that helped conceal the monster. So cameras would malfunction, or the creatures would happen to surface in just the very spot where most people couldn't see it, as though it could influence technology or presciently know where it could avoid being spotted. Of course, if it was something ordinary, we might say that the sightings where only one pair of eyes sees the object are more likely to be the ones that go unexplained, simply because if only one person sees it and can't get a photo of it, only one person needs to get it wrong. Maybe that's just me being cynical. Holliday published another book, actually it was published posthumously 7 years after his death, a book called The Goblin Universe. in which he tried to fuse Loch monsters and UFOs and Bigfoot and ghosts and poltergeists and reincarnation and the occult and basically you name it into a single unified theory of the paranormal, and that underlying hidden world interacts with and sometimes toys with the ordinary world, but also actively protects itself from scientific discovery. I mean, this guy came an unbelievably long way as an author, from like sea trout and how to catch them to the Goblin universe. But it's a really fascinating slice of late 20th century weird. There's some cool concepts to toy with, but he definitely left behind the world of scientific inquiry.
Yeah.
Across his books, I think you can see this need to distill and simplify things to a single underlying answer, even when there may not be one answer or even a single question. However, like I say, the invertebrate theory is an interesting and semi-conceivable one. It sits on at least the fringes of plausibility. If it came out tomorrow that Nessie was like a huge unknown worm, you know, if someone pulled some huge unknown worm out of Loch Ness, I'd be very surprised, but I would think it would be a nice, satisfying conclusion for everyone.
Yeah.
We would still have a monster that we could point at and go, there's the Loch Ness Monster, you know. Another candidate, and one that has had a lot of attention in recent years, is that some Loch Monster sightings are accounted for by unusually large fish. The most common suggestions are outsized sturgeon, catfish, or even giant eels.
Yeah, I remember hearing that before.
Now, Atlantic sturgeon, I don't know if you know this, Mike, I didn't know this, and it kind of blew my mind. The largest Atlantic sturgeon caught have been longer than a great white shark.
No way. Really?
24 feet or 7.2 metres.
Wow.
However, most are only 2 to 4 metres long when they reach full size. Or that's about 7 to 13 feet in old money. They're able to traverse between seawater and freshwater, and the larger specimens tend to be quite elongated in profile, so there's definitely something serpent-like about them.
Right.
They're so big, so powerful, that there are documented cases of fishermen being dragged to their deaths by these things.
Really?
Yeah. Although sturgeon are not a confirmed visitor to Loch Ness, they have been recorded in nearby sea lochs and river estuaries, so it's not inconceivable that some might occasionally migrate into the loch, although depending on the size of those, that does then run into some of the same issues of large animals having to swim through shallow rivers or climbing weirs or lochs and canals where they'd probably be spotted. Alternatively, it could be some kind of mutation that doesn't leave the loch and stays there for its whole lifespan. The sturgeon is a favourite of researcher Adrian Shine, who I think is your beardy man that you were talking about last episode, Mike.
Yes.
According to Roland Watson of the Loch Ness Mystery blog, the man whose name I couldn't remember last time, sorry Roland, according to Roland Watson, it came out in the year 2000 that Adrian Shine had secretly released his own sturgeon into a pond next to the Loch Ness Centre in Drumnadrochit.
Oh, Adrian.
Wait, this thing had grown to 6 feet in length, and the reason he was keeping it was to see if unsuspecting visitors would spot it and then how they described it without knowing that such a fish was present in the pond. For example, would they exaggerate the size of the unknown creature? Would their minds add features to it based on their expectations of Nessie? Personally, I think that would have been one of the cleverer experiments carried out there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the scheme was rumbled, so we never got to find out the answer to that. It seems some other Loch Ness investigators were unhappy about it. Some, as you instantly jumped to the conclusion there, Mike, some thought he was fattening it up to later dump in the loch and then catch it and claim he'd found the monster.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that assessment. I think Shine is legit. I'm a big fan of Adrian Shine, and I think he's got the right approach to this.
I'm a big fan of his beard.
You want to run your fingers through it?
Tremendous beard.
He's not simply trying to prove the existence of a monster in a biased way.
He's always come across as quite grounded whenever I saw him interviewed.
Exactly. I think he takes a similar approach to that which we take.
Yeah.
We would love there to be something, but we want to look at it as critically and as groundedly as possible. He's putting the question through some rigorous testing, in other words. Incidentally, there is a great video on YouTube where he's talking about all of this. It's a talk he did for the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's called Morphing the Loch Ness Monster. I highly recommend it. Similarly to sturgeon, catfish are not documented in the loch. They're actually not native to Scotland at all, but were introduced to some waters in the UK in the late 19th century, part of an upper-class fad for introducing foreign species.
That goes well. Whenever someone introduces a foreign species.
Oh yeah. But they have become acclimatised in some places. The interesting thing about catfish is that they live to an incredible age, over 100 years in some cases, and as they age, they never stop growing. They don't reach quite the same scale as sturgeon, at least the known species, but they have been known to grow to 2.5 metres long and 100 kilograms in weight. That's just under 8.5 feet and 220 pounds for the Americans out there.
I would think that was a monster if I saw that in the water and I didn't know what it was.
Absolutely, especially in Loch Ness. Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
They can survive in very cold water, but they don't tend to breed in water much colder than 20 degrees Celsius. The water of Loch Ness is a steady year-round 5.5 degrees at depth and between 6 and 13 degrees at the surface, depending on the weather, the time of year, and where on the loch you measure it. So it's never quite the ideal temperature for these things to spawn. The temperatures in Loch Morar are similar as well. It could be that they haven't spawned, that the first specimens released lived for 100 years, getting bigger and bigger, and then died off in the late 20th century. That would account for the drop in convincing sightings.
Do you know the only thing I would say about that is that another pet that I have is a terrapin, a red-eared terrapin.
Mm-hmm.
It's over 30 years old.
Yeah.
And I know that people they bought them because they were the size of a 50p piece when they buy them.
Yeah.
And then people released them into the wild. And you think of like turtles and tortoises as being quite docile for the most part.
Sure.
Or maybe like a snapping turtle or something like that. But like terrapins are actually quite aggressive.
Yeah.
And they'll tear up fish much bigger than themselves. But these animals, experts were like, well, don't worry about it. They're no longer sold, so they'll just die out because they can't breed in this climate. And they were absolutely certain about that.
Because of the temperature.
But then they started finding eggs recently.
I've seen terrapins in Kelvin Grove Park. There's terrapins live in the pond in Kelvin Grove Park.
Yeah.
It blew my mind. I thought it was a decoration when I saw it on the little island in the middle of the park.
Yeah.
And then it turned its head to look at me.
Maybe it was a monster. But
maybe it was a very small monster.
Yeah, but that's the whole point, is that sometimes they think, well, this animal...
Life finds a way?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes, Martin, that's exactly what I'm saying. But that sometimes you have an animal and you think it has these parameters.
Yeah.
And then you find out that either they can do more than that, or maybe all you need is one or two of them to have a little adaptation.
Yeah, they're driven to breed, so the other thing is, will they physically go out of their way to find a way to make it work? In terms of catfish, for example, it could be possible for them to spawn in pools and lochans outside the lochs themselves by following some of the streams and tributaries leading up from the lochs into the hills, at least until they get too big to make those journeys. The water temperatures in some small hill lochans can reach well into the 20s during a summer day.
Yeah.
Because there's a smaller volume to heat.
I was really surprised that you said that the temperature of the loch on the bottom is sort of stays at like 5 degrees throughout the year.
Aye, it never freezes. It never freezes.
Yeah, that's really wild to me, because why does it never...
It's just...
So it never freezes on the top?
Because of all that stored heat, essentially. It's an immense depth.
Right.
Although it sits higher than the surface of the sea by hundreds of feet, the bottom of it is much, much, much deeper than the North Sea. So that's why I'm saying if there is a monster, it's something that hides in the depths. It's not something that has to come to the surface all the time.
Right. What's the deepest point of the loch?
Let me just Google this for you, Mike. And then I'll edit it so it sounds like I knew it off the top of my head. 227 metres, or that's 745 feet.
So that's not going to be deeper than the North Sea?
It is. 227 metres.
In the entire North Sea?
There might be a point in the North Sea that's deeper, but certainly nowhere near Scotland.
Right.
And the North Sea is very shallow. Hold on. Deepest point of the North Sea is 700 metres, but on average, the depth is only 93 to 94 metres.
Really? Wow, I didn't realise that.
And in the south, it's only 25 to 35 metres.
That's nothing.
In the north, in the Bathel zone of the Shetlands, this depth increases to between 100 and 200 metres. So even in the areas where it's particularly deep, it's still shallower than Loch Ness, although there's obviously some like cracks and abyssal depths where it does go deeper. But yeah, Loch Ness is deeper than most of the North Sea. Back to catfish, Mike, back to catfish.
Good stuff.
In 2014, there was a bit of a flap around the idea of a giant catfish in Loch Ness. I don't know if you remember this, but enthusiasts from the official Loch Ness Monster fan club approached the Daily Mail, who are still very much in the Nessie business all these years after the surgeon's photo, incidentally.
Bet they are.
They absolutely are. And drew attention to a particular location on Apple Maps. A satellite map image appeared to show the outline of a giant, submerged, 20-metre long catfish-shaped object with fins and barbels sticking out of it. I remember seeing this all over the internet just a few years ago. Do you remember this, Mike?
Yeah, I think so.
I still see people mentioning this sometimes, but as we know, the rebuttal never gets as much press as the original story. This was unfortunately debunked as a stitching artefact, as the Jacobite Queen, a boat that runs tours on the loch, with the boat mostly faded out due to the blending process used where they stitched together two images to form the map, which left mostly just the white parts of the wake visible, which appeared to form the barbels and the fins.
Right.
The actual boat in the picture was identified from the shape of its bow and the signature of its wake. You can see comparisons online and they're pretty convincing. The year 2018, though, marked the return of some serious academic interest in Loch Ness and its inhabitants, both known and unknown. A team of researchers from the University of Otago in New Zealand, Hull University, the University of Copenhagen, and from Scotland, the University of the Highlands and Islands, undertook a huge environmental DNA survey of the loch. Essentially what they did was they took hundreds of water samples from all over the loch, then in the lab they amplified the tiny amounts of genetic material that had been left in the water in the form of cells, scales, hairs, fragments of skin, fecal particles and other traces, then analysed the DNA to get a list of species. They didn't do this to find a monster as a primary motive. Their goal was more to map the biodiversity of the loch in general, although it would seem that the choice of Loch Ness as a testbed for this technique was no accident. Dr. Neil Gemmell of Otago University said, "We have used the monster as the bait on the very big science hook. As soon as we talked about doing it in Loch Ness, we had a platform on which to communicate our science in a way that we have never been able to communicate it before. Essentially using the Loch Ness Monster angle as a way to get real science more outreach to the press and to interested lay people, to get this kind of work in front of kids who might be inspired by it," which I think is great.
Yeah, it's the most elaborate clickbait I've ever heard.
It's exactly what we were talking about last time, building those bridges between the world of the weird and the scientific as an outreach activity. I think it's highly commendable. Anyway, although Nessie wasn't the main focus of their study, they did pay particularly close attention to some of the more popular Nessie candidates for a monster. Of course you would. I mean, imagine doing that and not looking for a monster. You'd be mad.
Yeah. They would have been secretly hoping.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe not just hoping. We shall see. What did they find? Well, do you think they found any plesiosaur DNA, Mike?
No, but I kind of know what they found.
They didn't find any plesiosaur DNA. No surprise. In fact, they didn't find any reptile DNA at all. There's only 3 types of reptile native to Scotland, 3 or 4 types, and they're all land animals, so as expected there. They also did not find any sturgeon or catfish, I'm sorry to say. Another possible candidate they looked at, an idea you might have seen explored if you're a viewer of the show River Monsters, was that Greenland shark might sometimes migrate into Loch Ness.
Right.
Well, they didn't find any Greenland shark or sleeper shark or any shark DNA whatsoever. As an aside, I should mention that just because they didn't find any traces of these animals doesn't mean that those animals are not present or are never present. They didn't find any otter DNA either. and we know for a fact that otters live around there. It may be because otters are not exclusive to the water, they poop on land, they don't shed scales, but...
That's strange, though.
So maybe they're not leaving as much of themselves in the loch to be collected. In any case, it shows that false negatives are possible with this process, so that leaves a little window open to people if they wish. So we should be careful of ruling stuff out completely based on this. But what they did find, and I'm sure you saw it, was lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of eel DNA.
Yeah.
In fact, giant eels have been suggested as a Nessie candidate since at least the early 1930s. And this suggestion has seen a revival in recent years. It could be a strong contender for sightings where people have described large serpentine animals. For example, the McDonnell-Simpson encounter in Loch Morar, remember where the thing attacked the boat?
Yeah.
We talked about that in the first episode. Or things like Steve Feltham's sighting in 1993, where the object is described as large, long and low in the water, moving, quote, like a torpedo. Now, Mike, how well versed are you in the life cycle of the European eel?
Well, not very, but is it?
Not a scholar of eel reproduction?
not really. I did have a horrific encounter with an eel when I was.
Go on.
When I was wee. That makes it sound like I was in the water. It was actually more a horrific encounter with human beings. I was fishing in a river called the Endrick with my dad, and he used to take kids away on sort of fishing trips and things like that.
Yeah.
I always remember there was a couple other people who weren't part of our group that were fishing there, and they caught an eel, and it was like one of the guys was trying to kill the eel, and it was just like the most inhumane thing I've ever seen. He had like I think it was like a piece of a pipe, heavy piping, and he was trying to batter the eel to death. But the eel's so muscular and so
pleasant dreams, everyone.
It was a terrible thing, man. Sorry. But so the thing about eels, though, are they one of these animals that either migrates back to the same place to reproduce or anything like that?
Kind of. So eel reproduction was a scientific mystery in its own right until the 1920s. Until that time, no one had ever seen anything that was identifiably a baby eel. They just seemed to spontaneously appear as adolescents in the lakes and rivers of Europe. It was a Danish professor called Johannes Schmidt who figured it out. He discovered that after a period of between 5 and 20 years, the adult eels in the fresh and brackish waters around and in Europe reach sexual maturity, at which point they undergo physical changes that allow them to enter the open ocean. We knew about that. They then swim for 4,000 miles to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. We didn't know about that.
Incredible.
The Sargasso Sea is a strange, rich, weed-filled region of the North Atlantic Ocean, positioned in a calm area between the major oceanic currents. It lies north of the Antilles, west of the Azores, east of Florida and the Carolinas. Bermuda is situated within it. In fact, it has some overlap with the Bermuda Triangle, Mike. Not that that has any bearing on this, but it's a good freebie, right?
Yeah, just tie everything in. Just like
tie it all together. It's the Goblin universe.
Yeah, yes, I was about to say. Yeah. One explanation will rule them all.
So the animals spawn in the Sargasso Sea and then die, and their offspring, tiny larval eels, live there for a while feeding on jellyfish and other invertebrates in the dense vegetation of the Sargasso Sea to build up the energy for the slow, arduous journey back to Europe. These things are really small. There's almost nothing to them. They're like little tiny transparent leaves if you look them up. They're almost invisible, so unless you were looking for them, you'd miss them. So different to adult eels that they had actually been classified previously as a distinct species.
Wow.
The European eel doesn't typically grow longer than a metre. 1.5 metres is the record. But a metre or above is considered exceptionally large.
That's still big though, do you know what I mean? Like if you saw something like that in the water, a metre long animal, it doesn't sound large, but to me it still is.
I mean, it definitely is a big animal. However, there is a theory, and I should point out that I've only found mention of this from like self-appointed cryptozoologists, researchers like Richard Freeman of the CFZ, whom I have a great deal of respect for, don't get me wrong, but academia itself seems to be noticeably quiet on the nuts and bolts of this, so do treat what I'm about to say with some caution. But there is a theory that either due to a genetic mutation or exposure to chemical toxins or injury, some eels never undergo sexual maturation. Their gonads never produce the hormonal signals that trigger those physiological changes, allowing them to survive in saltwater and driving them to spawn in the Sargasso Sea. The theory further posits that these sterile or eunuch eels remain in freshwater and continue to eat and put on body weight, much like a neckbeard that never leaves his parents' basement.
Oh, Jesus, Martin. Did you have to? Did you have to? Someone's going to be listening to this. You know, they've had a bit of a hard time. They've ended up living for a long time in the basement of their parents' house, and you've just insulted them.
Okay, but they're not eels, Mike.
No, they're not. Well, I would hope not.
Maybe there's an eel sitting in a tank in the basement who's really offended. So they end up with, to continue with the neckbeard analogy, they have this huge quantity of food, and instead of going out and having sex, they just grow and grow and grow. So, alternatively, we could be looking at a subspecies or variety of European eel that has not yet been scientifically defined. Maybe something adapted to the fantastic depths, I can't say that word, depths of lochs like Ness and Morar, with a larger morphology than standard eels. A point of comparison would be the ferox trout, which are taxonomically members of the brown trout species and exist alongside brown trout in many places. There is some debate about whether ferox trout still count as a variety of brown trout or have evolved to become a different species, because these elusive monsters basically have adapted to a different lifestyle. They're actually cannibals of normal trout.
Right.
And are specialised to one particular environment, leaving them far larger and spectacularly different looking.
Vampire trout.
What is that particular environment? Large, deep, glacial lakes. Could the very same environment and a similar set of evolutionary pressures have likewise produced a variety of huge cannibalistic eel?
Cannibal eels.
Either one of these explanations would jive with the historical reports of anomalously huge eels in Britain's waterways. Richard Freeman has written of a 25-foot eel supposedly trapped in the Birmingham Ship Canal in the 1980s, which may have been an extremely long-lived example of a eunuch eel, although I have struggled to find any corroboration on that. That may be from some old newspaper report that just hasn't made it onto the internet yet. I don't know. As far as the Scottish Highlands are concerned, one particularly salient report comes from Captain Lionel Leslie, who was one of the founders of the Bureau that we discussed previously. Interviewing locals in the 1960s, he found surviving witnesses to an event that took place in Corpach, at the opposite end of the Caledonian Canal from Loch Ness in the Western Highlands in the year 1899 or thereabouts. At that time, workers were engaged in repairing the canal locks near where it enters Loch Linnhe. When they drained one stretch, they discovered an absolutely huge animal that, quote, resembled an eel but was much larger than any eel ever seen, and it had a long mane. The workers were convinced that the creature had made its way down the canal from Loch Ness. Now, that doesn't seem like the natural conclusion. Loch Ness is like 30 or 40 miles away near the other end of the canal, but, and this is really interesting, it appears that Loch Ness already had developed a reputation among those who worked on the waterways as being home to creatures like this.
Right. Did people talk about that in the same way as they talked about the Loch Ness Monster, or was that just something like the sort of modern legend of the Loch Ness Monster didn't really exist at that point? So
the modern legend of the Loch Ness Monster didn't exist at that point. That really started in the 1930s, as we touched on in the first episode. So it almost seems like this was insider knowledge among people who worked on the waterways. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but the impression almost seems like they thought, these are known to exist in Loch Ness, therefore it must have come from there. That's the impression I get from it, which is interesting because it lends some credibility to the idea, and it also feels like a kind of transitionary phase between Legends of the Waterhorse. This thing had a mane.
Yeah.
Almost like there's a transition between the Legends of the Waterhorse and the physical monster of Loch Ness. Anyway, there are other sources from the 19th century that talk of the lochs of South Uist in the Hebrides as being home to monstrously large eels. One such report comes from a priest called Father Alexander Campbell, who wrote in his memoir, "Another prominent feature of the Long Island is its innumerable lakes teeming with eels and trouts. Some of the former attain an almost incredible size. These eels make their way over land to the sea. I myself for some years was an eyewitness, one of these huge monsters appearing in a lake situated in the township of Boysdale, lashing at times furiously the water with its tail and making at the same time a hissing sort of noise. But for the last 3 years it has left the lake and is now not to be seen. Its disappearance was no matter of surprise to the inhabitants because they expect all monster eels of this description to make at length their way to the sea. It's equally known here that these eels migrate from one lake to another and crawl along the land like serpents. In confirmation of this fact, it was told by an eyewitness worthy of credence that he and others were assembled together on a Sunday evening on a knoll in Ormaclade and saw a great many seagulls assembling over a field at no great distance, darting now and then down to the ground. The unusual manoeuvres on the part of the gulls excited their curiosity, so they went to see what was making such a swarm of them congregate in one place. Upon their arrival, they discovered a number of large eels making their way to the neighbouring lake, which was more than a quarter of a mile distant from the one in which they had started. No consideration will reduce an Uist man or woman to taste an eel. They even entertain the strangest prejudice against those who do."
That's fascinating.
I couldn't find much on it, but I would like to have a look at some of those lochs on Uist now and see what's there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I wrote a story called Bits and Pieces that was about the South Uist mummy.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure that's one we can do an episode on. But I wonder, though, because I remember when you talked about the coelacanth at the start of the episode.
Yeah.
About that fish. And like you say, it was discovered in a fish market.
Yeah.
The whole point was that the locals, that wasn't an extinct fish to them.
Yeah, exactly.
They knew it existed. It's like when you hear about Amazonian tribes that say, no, there is a large reptile that lives in the Amazon. It exists. We've seen it. And people, they kind of scoff at this, but it's like, well, I mean, I know Scotland isn't like the Amazon in terms of remoteness, but I just mean that often if you go to the locals, okay, they might tell you some stories that are fictitious or have been exaggerated over time.
Yeah.
But they will be the ones who will know if there is anything there.
Yeah, and it could be something that is now extinct, that was still kicking around at the end of the 19th century, and maybe you get a few stragglers here and there still. It could be a rare mutation that has at certain points in history been more common. Mm-hmm. It could even be something that is a rare visitor.
Yeah.
You have, for example, waxwings, which are birds from Europe that typically don't come to Scotland, but in certain years, there's like a smaller crop of berries in Norway and places like that. There's not enough for them to eat, and they actually migrate to Scotland, and they're seen here, even though they're not normally resident here. So it could be along those lines too.
Also, if you're talking about like the 19th century, the waterways were polluted so badly.
Yeah.
In a lot of places that, I mean, it's possible that there could have been something.
This was actually something I was going to try and avoid talking about because I thought this was going to make the episode too long, but now you've hit it right on the chin. I think I'm going to mention it. And I don't have the full details in front of me, but I had a little theory. I don't mean that I believe this is what's happening, but it was just something that occurred to me and I've never seen it mentioned anywhere. Remember the aluminium factory that was mentioned in the first episode? Remember the guy that took the first photograph of Nessie worked at an aluminium factory in Foyers?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I did a little bit of research, and among the metals that can pollute the water and have an effect on fish gonads, for want of a better word, aluminium and cadmium are among those. So it actually occurred to me maybe there was some influence of pollutants from that aluminium works. That aluminium works shut down, I think it was at the end of the 60s. Now, the golden age of Nessie sightings runs from the 30s through to the 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
I wonder if there was some connection there. I don't know. It'd be interesting maybe for some environmental scientists to go and have a look at the historical pollutants and things.
That's fascinating though. So you're saying then, because what I was meaning was that maybe something could have been killed off, but what you're saying is, well, maybe some of the pollutants actually stop these eels from reaching sexual maturity in the normal way.
Yeah.
and they just kept growing,
Exactly.
basically. They just kept eating. Maybe they reached larger sizes.
I'm not saying I've cracked the case, but that did occur to me.
It's an interesting theory. It's really interesting.
Just a little aside. In terms of we've looked at some historical reports of giant eels. Perhaps a video captured in the River Ness in September 2019. Would that tickle your fancy, Mike?
That most certainly would. Why haven't I heard of this,
Okay,
Martin?
so you can maybe fire this up online, actually. The Ness Fishery Board are a statutory body, a government-funded NGO, responsible for monitoring and protecting the salmon and trout populations of the Ness district. As part of this mission, they operate a series of fixed underwater cameras at points along the River Ness so that they can survey what fish are coming in and out of the loch. And yeah, that's another reason why you've not got plesiosaurs coming up and down the River Ness. But on the 1st of September, one of those cameras captured a huge eel-like shape.
Oh, man.
He's just seen it, okay.
Oh, man. There it is.
So one of those cameras captured a huge eel-like shape slithering through the murky water, and as you can hear from Mike's reaction, quite impressive. I mean, it's right on the edge of visibility, but it's definitely an eel.
Yeah. I was going to say it could be a piece of wood, but...
No, look at it. Look, it's moving. It's wiggling its body from side to side. It's definitely an
Hold
eel.
on, I'm going full screen, everybody.
Turn the brightness up as well.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It is actually... Yeah.
So you can see the video for yourself if you search for it on Twitter. There's some enhanced screenshots doing the rounds as well, if you look for those.
I hadn't heard anything about this.
It's hard to get an exact length because there's not a lot of scalable objects in the frame, but judging by the fact it stretches almost the whole length of the screen, and it absolutely dwarfs the much closer, I think it's a trout in the foreground.
It looks almost like a snake. See the shape of its head?
It's right on the edge of the river's visibility, so to me, it looks like it's well beyond the normal European eel size range, at least 1.5 metres. I would say maybe up to 3 metres, or that's 10 feet, roughly.
Yeah, that's a monster, Martin. That's a monster.
Yeah, exactly. While that's far from a Nessie that we are led to believe, according to some reports, is 30 foot, 50 foot, 100 foot long, it's still a considerable animal, capable of making a considerable disturbance at the surface, and aside from anything else, it's a valuable record because it goes to show that eels far larger than standard size do exist in the waters around Loch Ness. And there's nothing to say that that's anywhere near the biggest. It may simply be an extreme outlier on the bell curve of eel size, or it might finally be evidence of a population of larger eels in the loch and its environs. Some of the materials put out by the University of Otago, following their study, suggest that they consider 12 foot or 3 to 4 metre European eels to be within the realms of possibility. Take a 3 metre long eel making a fuss at the surface of Loch Ness, throw in a few excited eyewitnesses, Mike, I think you could have reports of a 5 or 10 metre long monster in the papers before you knew it.
It's not just that, Martin. It's like I'm looking online, an image of it's on the ABC News website, where they're showing that video from the Ness fishery. But it's like they've also got an image of a European eel from 2004 on that same page. And you just look at that and it's a serpent. It's a sea serpent.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
exactly.
Looking at the face and also that image that's here, its body's, it's angled its head up. Now, whether it could do that out of the water, maybe it couldn't, but like it's still...
Yeah.
Just, it totally ticks the box for what you would think of as a loch monster.
It's a really strong contender.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, some pro-Nessie commentators think it's a bit of a cop-out. They think, oh, it's like a debunking of the monster.
And that's what an explanation is, though. Unless it's like...
Well, yes, this is what I'm coming to. So, on one hand, the goal shouldn't be to prove a monster exists. It should be to determine whether a monster exists. But on the other hand, as you said, Michael, and I'm going to paraphrase Richard Freeman, a cryptozoologist, as quoted in a recent newspaper article, a giant eel, which can grow up to 30 feet, or I would add even 10 feet or 15 feet, is a monster in every sense of the word.
Yeah.
It is a monster.
This is the thing with, like, monsters are physical. They're animals.
Yes.
If you see a video of a grizzly bear charging at someone,
exactly.
You tell me that, if you didn't know what that was, you tell me that's not a monster.
Exactly. I would be very interested to see the results of Adrian Shine's experiment with the sturgeon if it hadn't been rumbled, because I think a 3 metre eel is absolutely a monster, but also those reports we have of things much, much bigger than that.
Yeah.
Could they just be the sense of the shock and the...
But then it's so difficult. If you've got a vast area of water, it is so difficult to actually tell what sort of size something is, and you could think something's 30 feet long, and it could be a couple of meters. But as I said, someone who's not, even someone who is familiar with that, if you see something that looks like a serpent going through the water, and even if it's like 1.5 meters long, which sounds as if that's more than acceptable, and 3 meters is even acceptable, maybe even 10. Like, even 1.5 meters is still something that would cause you concern, put it that way.
Absolutely, totally agree. I think the eel theory is a very, very interesting proposition. You've got something that has a long and snake-like body. It's a fish with gills, so it isn't obliged to surface all the time. They swim very fast, and although they can be found throughout the water column, chasing fish and whatnot, Mike, they love the deep lake floors where they spend most of their time in and around the liquid mud and the silt, which would offer them protection from sonar and stuff like that. So
yeah, that's a great point.
Admittedly, there are a few problems with eels being our lake monsters. As far as I'm aware, they don't stick their necks up vertically in the traditional Nessie pose out of the water.
Yeah, that image, it's difficult because that image I was talking about is under the water, so it is different, but it can clearly be at an angle.
Yeah.
But not, like you say, like the classic Nessie neck.
But I get a feeling that the classic Nessie pose of the thing with its head straight up out of the water is far more likely to be either a hoax inspired by the surgeon's photo and the traditional image which is formed based on that hoax.
Yeah.
Or is related to the cormorants, because if you see a cormorant sitting on the water, it looks a lot like that shape, and if you get a mirage, that can be magnified. So I'm automatically suspicious of the traditional Nessie pose. What's much more interesting is sightings of like dark shapes moving under the water, things just breaking the water, huge long shapes moving very quickly through the water, and I think an eel is a great candidate for that. I would also say that no matter how long an eel might grow, realistically they're not going to have the body mass to produce that kind of upturned boat shape that a lot of people report seeing.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like I say, I don't think it has to account for those things. As we've already discussed, the more and more evidence that we look at, or at least the more and more evidence that I look at, the more I'm convinced that sightings of a huge variety of different objects, animals and phenomena are being lumped together under the heading of Loch Ness Monster, simply because people are arriving at these lochs loaded with expectations. These expectations are driven by a reputation that these lochs have, which again brings us back to the question, did these reputations arise spontaneously from myth and superstition, or is there something substantive behind it? Were they founded on some seed of truth that has snowballed out of control? I remain uncertain, but if I had to place a bet...
I'm just looking there at... It's actually a research paper about the European eel, and it's about how it loses its skeletal framework across its lifetime.
Mm-hmm. That's when it travels to the sea. It also dissolves its guts as well.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if... I mean, what would the bone be anyway? Would it be cartilage, or is it...
Yeah, that's something definitely to look into. But actually, eels have negative buoyancy.
Right.
So they typically tend towards the bottom of the loch. They don't float to the surface when they die. For the most part, they drop. So you wouldn't necessarily expect to have them floating to the surface. As I say, if I had to place a bet on there being one element of this mystery legitimately unknown to science, something contributing to these legends, continuing to this day, then I think the occasional appearance of monstrous eels over the years and over the centuries is where I would definitely put my money. I wouldn't have particularly high hopes of getting my money back, but if I had to pick, that's where I'd throw my lot in.
It seems very reasonable. And I suppose maybe that's partly what people that hope for a plesiosaur or a dinosaur or some huge reptile that we've never discovered before, like people that hope for those things, they might feel a bit bummed out by this.
It being an eel?
Yeah, by this sort of explanation, and they might say that, well, it's something that seems reasonable and you're trying to sort of take away the mystery of it. But, I think, it seems really legitimate to me.
But I mean, the jury is still very much out on whether there's even genuinely a question to be answered in the matter of Scotland's lochs. If there's nothing to it though, then why here? Why are legends of water monsters so stubbornly attached to Scotland's lochs for centuries, for millennia even? If I was to take a sceptical view, I might return to the Kelpies of the first episode and ask, is it telling these ancient water spirits transformed into modern depictions of prehistoric creatures coinciding with the arrival of Hollywood monster movies?
Yeah.
Maybe dark and lonely waters simply invite speculation as to what lies beneath, and that tends to jive with whatever the zeitgeist is. It always conjures up the image of whatever the appropriate monster of our era is, and perhaps few waters feel as dark and lonely as those that lie against the backdrop of Scotland's dark skies and barren hills and crumbling castles. But maybe not. Maybe we will all be surprised and one day someone will pull a hideous, completely unknown monstrosity out of Loch Ness, and it won't be an eel, it won't be a sturgeon, it'll be some
Ted Danson.
groundbreaking zoological discovery. Ted Danson, or a giant Tully monstrum or something. Unlikely, but maybe. And I will always hope that there is a real monster, although I do like the eel. I have to say I do like the eel. As much as I maybe don't expect there to be something completely unexplained, as much as I will always try to prevent that hope from clouding my judgment on it, as long as there is a controversy, as long as there is a mystery, people will be drawn to it, and I will always be one of them, and I'm sure you will be as well, Mike.
Absolutely.
I absolutely don't take up with the position that entertaining ideas about monsters is somehow detrimental to science and undermining rational civilization. This isn't like people saying vaccines cause autism or something. This isn't harming anyone, and it isn't an intellectual dead end. I don't know about you, Mike, but my early interest in monster legends as a child helped spur a fascination with science and zoology that continues to this day.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point. I do think that one thing that sometimes gets missed out of scientific papers is that there should be, I mean, that they do include it in part, that there should be like a part of a scientific paper which is like, here's the speculation, just to play around with some ideas that may be nonsense, they may be completely wrong, but here's some threads.
Like separated off in its own little area.
Yeah, totally.
Here we allow ourselves to speculate.
Totally, not in your conclusion, not in looking over the results or anything like that, not even in the introduction or the abstract or anything. Separate part this is for speculation, and we may be, it's like a scattergun approach, we may be throwing anything against the wall as an idea, but you know what, another scientist may read this and may go, there's something in a part of that.
Yeah.
And then they may be spurred on into an idea. I think that does get lost a little bit, but people are too afraid to give legitimacy to things, and I can understand that as well.
That's a really interesting perspective. I mean, not as part of like new research. I'm not like an academic researcher who's writing a paper here, but even just as a layperson, in the process of me researching loch monsters for these podcasts, I've learned a whole host of new things about the life cycle of eels, about the geology of Scotland, the history of Celtic myths and legends, environmental DNA surveys. I've learned more about how sonar works. Because I'm interested in this topic, I've gone down a rabbit hole that's caused me to learn about all these other things. You know, hopefully with stuff like the University of Otago eDNA study, academia is slowly coming back around to the idea that the world of the mysterious or speculative type ideas can be a rich resource for education and science outreach, even if cryptozoology itself isn't recognised as a science per se. With more attention on this kind of thing, hey, maybe there are big groundbreaking discoveries to be made, but even if not, a big alluring mystery like this exerts a powerful attraction on the human psyche. We're hardwired to pay attention to stories of mystery and dangerous beasts. The hope of an encounter with something unexplained draws like 500,000 tourists to Loch Ness alone.
Yeah.
The draw that it commands should be an absolute gift to those whose vocation it is to engage the public with science and the natural world. And with the challenges facing the natural world today, I think that is a very important thing.
I couldn't have put it better myself.
That, I think, draws to a close this trilogy of episodes on the Loch Monsters of Scotland. It has been A marathon effort, Mike.
Thank you so much for all of your research, mate. It's been you've put so much effort into these episodes.
Oh, man,
it's been thrilling for me as well, because, like you say, like yourself, I was sort of drawn into the world of Loch monsters, when I was a kid, and
yeah,
it's been fascinating learning all the things that you've found out about them.
It's not been like work because, as you say, it's a fascinating subject.
Yeah.
I will be glad to finally move on full steam ahead to other topics. You've mostly been bringing the variety to Talking Till Dawn while I've been hanging on this one subject. It feels like we've been living under the shadow of Nessie for a few months now, so it will be good to focus on some other weird and wonderful things. I'm really looking forward to that. I've really enjoyed going down this rabbit hole, and I hope the listeners have as well. Thanks to everyone who has subscribed to the podcast on Spotify, on Apple and Google, and wherever else you get your podcast. We really are grateful. It helps us no end, and it helps ensure you guys don't miss an episode. And boy, do we have some exciting and weird and disturbing episodes lined up for you.
We definitely do. I can't wait.
If you've got any suggestions, feedback, or you just want to say hi, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love you to get in touch with us. Tweet Talking Till on Twitter. That's at TALKINGTILL. I think the sun's coming up, Mike. Is there anything you want to say before we go?
Just that I'm a little bit sad that we're leaving Nessie behind now, but who knows, maybe we'll find something Loch Monster orientated down the line to talk about again. There are many other lake monsters, so...
Exactly. There's so many things that I didn't include in this simply because we weren't going to have time. So maybe we'll return to it one day. Maybe there'll be more discoveries made. Maybe there'll be more controversy. Maybe there'll be more sightings. Perhaps we'll come back to it one day. We'll have more episodes out soon, so subscribe to keep updated. And until the next time, take care of yourselves.
Bye for now.